That name. Hello and welcome to the next episode of the Change Troubleshooter podcast. And I'm here with Patrick Hillberg, who, if you remember, was my guest and the last episode of the Change Troubleshooter podcast, where we took on the subject of changing mindsets on an industrial model. So if you haven't listened to that yet, you might want to tune into that before you listen to this. Because at the end of that podcast, Patrick, you very interestingly said that actually we should continue this conversation by you asking me some questions so that we started tapping into the change elements of this.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, I give a moderate number of public talks, and I feel like a public talk always works best when it's kind of the continuation of a conversation. So that's where we were at the end of the previous podcast, and actually a little bit of behind the scenes stuff. Nina and I have been chatting for the last hour or so before we even started recording this. So hopefully it does come across as kind of the continuation of a conversation. It was a great conversation that we had last time. Actually, I found that your podcast is really good to listen to while I'm out biking. So I thank you. I appreciate it for that. So,
Perfect. So today we've decided to call this one "How to Change a Mindset."
Yes, that's right. And I'm very big on that. I should say I teach a course called Product Lifecycle Management. It's for graduate engineering managers. And a big theme to the course is if we want better products, we need better cultures. So really, I'm not sure. I've been teaching the class 10 years, and probably 6 or 7 years ago, I really got into culture change. That this PLM course is now primarily about organizational and culture change. And then, as we'll talk about very shortly, actually, 2020 was a big change. So in my case, as far as teaching the class, um, there was one point in March where I realized that all of the universities on the East Coast, all the universities on the West Coast of the US, and all the universities in the state that's just south of where I am in Michigan, all those universities had closed, and there was just no way that we were going to stay open for the rest of the semester. So that was a big change there. I told my students we're going to go online for the foreseeable future. That future lasted for 18 months before it is literally for my class, because I only teach in the winter semester. So we went online in March of 2020, and we were not back in person until February of 2021. February of 2022. In any event, this world that we're dealing with has really changed. And Nina, I talk to you, and I see a lot of your posting and your blog. And anyway, it's always interesting. So let me start out with a really big and high level question. There's this 15th century English poet that he's from England, so you may be familiar with him. His name is William Shakespeare.
Oh, maybe I've heard of him. Yeah. So, I think he's sort of known in these parts.
Sort of known it, yeah. Okay, probably just because he's from that area originally. So, and I think it was Hamlet. Hamlet says there's more in heaven and earth, Horatio, than is dreamt of in your philosophy. And I take that 16th century statement right there and say, I think that this is where we may be at right now. So on December 31st, 2019, the World Health Organization and the Chinese CDC said, oh, wait, we have a disease that might become a worldwide pandemic. And they were clearly right in that. And we saw the collapse that happened right after that point. And quite frankly, a lot of the challenges that we're having right now, supply chain collapses and inflation and that sort of thing, many people relate that back to this pandemic change. And then for my own self, I became much more interested in climate change. I always had a passing interest, but it became a very real thing in the process of responding to COVID-19 and saying that, boy, many of these things that we saw in COVID-19, I think, are going to continue again as we're dealing with a changing climate. So finally, I get to a question for you. um, if if what we thought was, I mean, everything we thought was real for the last 200, 250 years, I claim that that came to an end on December 31st, 2019. Our mindsets, which were based on that, maybe need to change going, and I think into this decade. So first, do you buy my premise that we're underneath a massive societal change? And if we are underneath a massive societal change, how do we get to mindset change?
Great questions.
Very big picture.
Yes, yes. I also believe we are perhaps not on a tipping point yet, but we are moving with speed towards societal change that is difficult to bring that to one topic, I think, like climate change. I think that society is changing in a number of ways, and the continual set of shocks that we have felt since the pandemic are highlighting those changes. So think if we take the first shock that there was an actual global pandemic that impacted people in the developed Western world, that was shock number one. That, things like that were for lesser developed countries with not as much money, not as much power. The fact that it impacted America and the UK and Europe and all the countries that we feel more traditionally are protected from that kind of shock was a huge shock in itself. And that did show, I think, in a lot of ways, that we can have a mindset change because people, after the initial shock, life did change. So people's mindset maybe didn't change and they really were angry about it, or they found it difficult to deal with a shock of that nature. So those people did exist, but we end up breaking these moments down into lots of different components. Did we find it difficult to be kept inside? Did we find it difficult to lose our freedom? Do we find it difficult not to have contact with our loved ones? Did we find it difficult not to be able to hug somebody else? Did we fear that we might catch this disease and die from it? And did we fear that that death might be very unpleasant because of all the pictures that we were seeing on the TV? And that experience will stay with people for a very long time. And I think that leads me just to take a step back and say, what our mindset comes from our experiences in life generally. And it's important that we acknowledge that what's in our minds and the way that we see the world has come from the way we have experienced the world to that point. And we don't really talk about that so much because we're not really open about a lot of our experiences, and we don't really analyze how those experiences really affect how we see things today. But we must, because they do. And it doesn't matter. You may think that the things that you hold on to, the things that you're so certain in life about, a belief system, maybe even a religion, a way of working, a way of exercising, a way of studying, all of those components go back to experiences you've had all the way through your life, whether you're conscious of them or not conscious of them.
Yeah, I've become very interested in cognitive biases, particularly um, availability bias and confirmation bias. But I think what you're talking about is, I mean, much of what you're talking about, as I listen to it, I'm starting to think about availability bias, that we're biased towards the things that we can see most closely ourselves.
Yeah, bias is it's again another very difficult topic to break down, because when you say to somebody, if I say to you, Pat, oh, you're bound to say that because you're biased towards that, and then the obvious response is to go, oh, really? Am I? Is it because of my bias, or actually is it because I know this to be true? I believe it. It's not, I'm not biased, but actually, because we again are led to believe that bias is something negative. If someone says to you you're biased, it's typically you feel a little bit insulted by that. No, oh, I'm not. But actually, it's something that, of course, we all have. We Bias is something that is in all of us. We can't help it. It's not. It's not a negative and it's not a positive. It just is. But again, if our experience is that you have been told that your bias is negative, then you associate it with that. Or if the way that we talk about it is always using negative language, then that's how we perceive it. And this is so important to this little journey we're going to take on understanding mindset, because it's so much more to do with what we're exposed to and these outside influences than things that we create ourselves from within us, if that makes sense.
Yes, yes, certainly. I agree with you. There is a negative connotation on, there's a bias against the word bias, right? So there's a negative connotation on bias. And um, I don't I don't want to say it's either positive or negative, but we need to recognize that these things happen. And because so it just helps us to understand ourselves that which I think is important to changing mindsets, is what is what information, what environment has been available to me in my life, and how do I reflect on the entire world? Do I assume that the entire world aligns with what my own personal experiences are? But of course it doesn't. So my own neurons in my brain have been programmed the way they are based on the environment that I've been in, and you can then just call that in the aggregate availability bias.
Yeah,
So
and the pandemic offered us so many opportunities to analyze this. Because still today, actually, even if I take this morning, I went for a walk down a canal towpath, so it's narrow, and we still will meet people. I will still meet people who will not pass me on that towpath anymore, because that proximity, that we will be very close to each other, still remains a scary prospect in some people's minds. And I experience that on a regular basis, even though in my mind, I have completely overcome any fear I had of the virus. Because in my mind, a different set of parameters applied in my head. I keep myself quite healthy. I've got a good immune system. I am typically not afraid of things like this. I'm maybe more reckless than conservative when it comes to things like this. I don't automatically think I'm going to catch something. And if I did catch it, I truly believe that I'd be able to fight it off anyway. And that's all within me, because my life experience leads me to be in that position. But I know that is not the same for other people. And if other people have had a situation where they lost a family member to that virus, or they got really sick, or they knew somebody that was really sick, then all those parameters exist today, even when, and more dangerously for them in their minds, the world has returned to normal. And they will think, how? Because that virus is still with us. So, how can you still pass me so closely? Because we shouldn't be doing that. We shouldn't ever be doing that because the virus is still here.
Well, and I think I mean, you make a great point on the virus, although I think it's on COVID, the coronavirus. And I think there's a larger point. And you talked about you talked about normalcy, and there's a normalcy bias. And I think some of what we have seen in the last, and to some extent, your own point, your own actions are a desire to return to normal. And so do I. I carry a mask with me because it makes other people comfortable, but I only wear it when there's other people wearing a mask, right? So that's a social norm sort of thing. That's not a fear. I mean, that's a desire to return back to normalcy. So but when we're working with when you're working with the organizations that you're working with, particularly in what I'll say, I think this decade is a big transition between what was normal prior to December 31st, 2019, and what will be normal in, let's say, December 31st, 2029. How do you help individuals change their mindsets to recognize that sort of systemic change?
Well, I don't think we have seen systemic change.
Yeah, right.
So there, and I think this is an excellent conversation, isn't it? Because just between the two of us, we're going to highlight just how difficult this is. Because I thought that, based on everything that was happening and going back to what we've just been talking about, initially when the pandemic broke out and a whole load of rules were set for us, the world did change. For a moment there, it really did. And in the main, we adapted to that change, which was a phenomenal behavioral case study to observe. And yeah, there was the odd person who broke the rules, and and they were on the TV and made to feel bad because they were doing something that all of us wanted to do. Oh, in the main, all of us wanted to do. And those poor people had been caught and they were held up, just like the olden days when for me, I imagined here where I live in Lynn, we have old stocks in the village centre where back in the day, so if we'd have broken lockdown rules back then, you'd have been in those stocks. And really the equivalent was that you were on TV, or some reporter was chasing you down saying, how did you feel when hundreds of people were dying in hospital and you broke those rules? A terrible experience, which will have affected those people quite profoundly. And so their experience again will be very different. And all the time I observe these things. I like to say I am not a rule follower. Of course I am a rule follower, because in the main we are. I don't run red lights, I don't put anyone in danger. But do I follow rules just because somebody has told me to do it without thought? No, I don't. And that was really put under the microscope during the pandemic. And yet I watched a large part of the global population following rules because they were just told to, which made me think, wow, that is how easy it is to change a mindset. Because actually, when we say these things are very complicated, when people feel fear, and real fear of life, then they will follow rules regardless of what they think about them. And that changes a mindset then. And so it shows you that that change is possible. Because a lot of the time I relate change of mindset to breaking habit. And we know how notoriously hard it is to break habit. But in a situation that is life-threatening, as many people thought it was at that time, they broke habit immediately.
I should say that the U.S. response might have been different than that. the, the cultural response in the U.S.
Well, how?
Oh, I think when you look at mask wearing, or if you look at the people who were willing to get vaccinated, particularly when the first vaccine came out, it was maybe 60% of the US. So even though the vaccine was free, the only cost was whatever time it took to do it and a little bit of a poke in your arm. There was a strong resistance to, I mean, of about 40% of the people of getting vaccinated. So even when lives were at risk, even when you were putting your own life at risk to not get vaccinated, there was that was socially normal within subgroups. That this is becoming kind of a sociology conversation, but that was socially acceptable within a significant part of the U.S. population um, through 2021 and 2020 and in 2021. I haven't looked recently at what the vaccination rates are, but they're not 100%, and they're probably in the 50 to 60% range. So,
And this leads us into another brilliant part of how we break this down, because at the time you had a president that had a particular view, his own mindset on what this virus was going to do, how dangerous it was, how people were affected. So the messaging that was coming from the top, echelons of your country was pretty interesting, and actually not in agreement with the messaging that was going out if we just use the UK and we use Europe. And if we use the UK as comparison, I will take responsibility for this statement. I have always said that Boris Johnson was mini Trump, and so to begin with, we had a similar kind of messaging. It's well documented that Boris Johnson did not think that this virus was a real issue to people's health until he got it himself. And then the situation changed. And so all the time, this process of what you know yourself, the external influences coming on, the media. I mean, in today's world, the impact of media messaging is phenomenal to mindsets. So all of that coming together is layering all the time the mindset that you have.
yeah, I want to get to another cognitive bias now. I mean, this is a nice entry into confirmation bias.
Yeah.
That in this is also quite well documented, that the social media apps, and by the way, you and I met on LinkedIn, so it's not like we don't do that, right? But
Yeah.
the the social media apps, the social media algorithms are triggered to keep you engaged, and a way to keep you engaged is to give you the sort of information. You feel good when you see a piece of information that confirms what you already know, right? You feel smart because, hey, I look at this, I was just saying XYZ 8 days ago, and here's an article that says XYZ, so I was right. So, and therefore I read that article and I spend more time on that article, and then the next article comes that confirms that and confirms that and confirms that. So, you know, okay, so it's funny, in my class I walk right up to the line of politics. I try not to go over that line. I will say that I did not vote for the person who won the presidency in either 2016 or when he ran again in 2020. That said, with one exception, Donald Trump received more votes for president than any person in American history.
Yeah.
And that exception was Joe Biden. And Donald Trump and about 40% of the electorate don't believe that either. and they can find many places of confirmation bias. They can find many places to confirm what it is that they already believe. So I won't ask you how do you change that mindset, because that becomes a very big thing. But how, I mean, we're very convinced of what we believe. It's very difficult to change mindsets, which is why you and I are sitting here talking today.
It's so difficult, and and yet it is so interesting.
Yeah.
What I find this topic just absolutely captivating at every level, and I don't understand why other people don't, because this is the key. How do we change a mindset? Is Donald Trump was the master of this for his campaign. He introduced the concept of fake news. That changed mindsets straight away. And this is the thing that I think just gets missed. I don't know why there aren't even TV programs about this, because if we did do some scenario setting where we took real examples and we took what Donald Trump did and the introduction of that statement of fake news, and then that reconfirming of what fake news was, when he was taking real factual things and saying they're fake, and then he was convincing people that they were fake. So now he has such a loyal group of followers who absolutely believe his view of the world, the way he sees it. And that is manipulation at the highest level, which of course is what can happen when we're talking about changing mindsets. So we do, I think, fall into this trap where we think all the time it's very difficult to change a mindset. But history shows us over and over that it's not. But people tend to not do it for things that we would perceive to be greater good. So maybe what we should be thinking about is, why don't the people who want to do something good, and if we take the issue of climate change, why is it so difficult to change a mindset on climate change? When it was not, it's not, as we've said, there are examples where we have been able to, if change mindset. So if Donald Trump believed in climate change, so he got a whole host of people to believe that climate change didn't exist. It was a hoax. It was something that was being dreamt up by scientists who had nothing better to do, and that there was nothing wrong with the continuing push for fossil fuels. He got a lot of people to believe that. So many people that actually it started to change legislation in one of the most important countries in the world where we needed support on this. And now Biden is trying to do something different and trying to bring the legislation in now that supports the efforts of climate change activists and people who want to see the world differently. But all the time now, they are going to have to fight a population of people that only a couple of years ago we're told the opposite. And
So
that's where it becomes difficult.
let's look at balance points a little bit, and the flip side is that President Biden also went to Saudi Arabia and said, please increase your production of oil. But let's look a little more generic than that. And much of the inflation, worldwide inflation that we're seeing currently is driven by high energy prices. And certainly some of that is driven by the war in Ukraine. But if I'm trying to figure out how to frame my question, lower inflation right at the moment requires more petroleum. More petroleum creates more greenhouse gases, and more greenhouse gases make life more difficult for people now and in the future. And we're seeing 40-degree temperatures in England, and we're seeing, I heard this morning, 53-degree Fahrenheit or Celsius temperatures in Pakistan, and not to mention the massive flooding that's going on in Pakistan. So how do we, which mindset takes precedence, low inflation or low carbon?
So you and I both also love the topic of system change.
Yeah.
So we know that by taking that question, we're jumping into the middle of the system, because actually the reason that we're having any of these conversations about inflation and the energy crisis is all because our economic system is still organized in a way that fossil fuels underpin that. And so we haven't changed our mindset on a new economic system, even though globally around the world, this economic system now has started to fail in a number of places. And it's not just about climate change. It's actually more to do with population change, and where populations are growing, where populations are aging. And then on top of the population growth and age ranges, we're then having to map that against geography and how that geography is changing, and the climate within that geography is changing. So the impact on the key things, we go to, I think, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that only a while ago, even I debated in sessions that I run, that how valid was Maslow's hierarchy of needs anymore. Well, I laugh at myself now thinking, well, that's come right back, hasn't it? Because we are absolutely talking about the basics now. Do you have shelter? Do you have any energy? Do you have food? We are talking about those basic items that now humans need to survive. And when we're taking that global outlook, that's where we are. And the economic model that underpins that is failing in so many parts of the global world. But sadly, even though you and I also joke about this global governance that should be in place, and you have a nicer name for it that I can't remember right now. When we're chatting, you call it something. Anyway, it'll come back at some point. But I think many people would agree, by now we should have transitioned to some sort of global governance system. The fact that we're messing about with local politics all the time while the global world is suffering seems to be very petty, and there is no mechanism to allow these global discussions to take place. Although we try things like COP, and we try, the United Nations, and we have the different G20 and all these, they are still so focused on the issues of a sovereign nation. And that means that the empathy that we have in a systematic approach for the world as one doesn't exist. And because that doesn't exist, then we can't dissect and we can't jump into answering the question about, a fossil fuel economy, because what is the outcome? We need global outcomes now. Our system needs to have global outcomes, because the downside we're going to see of not having this global approach to organizing our world affairs and economic models is going to be seen first and foremost in migration. And we're already seeing that, even in a small place like the UK, so much of our news is negatively focused on migration, yet that is going to be one of the first things that we see. Whether that be, and we very neatly try and segregate these things out and say, oh, well, they're an economic migrant, as if that is a terrible thing. But being an economic migrant is a real thing. If we think about our hierarchy of needs, what is it that you need? And especially in this world, we need money. If you've got no money, how are you supposed to live? So, and then we get down to even harsher basics of people will not have food, they will not have water, and the land will not be livable. So as well as the population, and whether a population is aging or we've got a very youthful population like we have in Africa, it won't matter. Everyone at some point will be in the wrong place. So there will need to be a complete movement of people around the world. So, and our mindsets are nowhere near that kind of thinking. System change at that level, I sadly, touch on conversations with people like you, Patrick, but, in the greater world, I don't turn on the TV and get to contribute to a conversation of global system change in this way.
Yes, actually, and you brought up two words that are favorites of mine, empathy and systems thinking. That, and actually, I'm even going to tie this to, well, we have an economic approach that says that if each person individually achieves their own goals, that becomes the larger societal goal. But we're also seeing where that is falling apart. And once again, I mean, we're not only is the atmosphere containing more, not only is the world getting warmer, but this is impacting different parts of the world in different ways. And my country emits more greenhouse gases per capita than any other country, and yet we're not yet really suffering the facts. We don't have a massive flooding that's currently going on in Pakistan, for example. So, or the major droughts that are expected really through the equatorial belt, South America and Africa and such like. So this, how do you balance this in a capitalistic environment?
Well, it can only be through excuse me, it can only be through education, can't it? I think, if we accept that we've got to this position through exposure of everything that we had coming towards us, and particularly over the last 10 years, I'd say, where the internet became mainstream, social media exploded. So that exposure has accelerated, I think, a lot of conditioning. I mean, that's what it is, that we are being conditioned all the time. And even listening to this podcast is conditioning of a certain kind. And again, I don't think that these things, typically when I talk about people being conditioned, again, that is perceived to be negative. And these are the things that I think the education system has to start changing. So when we're talking about things and people are at the point where they're open to learn, so they have decided to do something, take one of your courses, or go to school to do something, that is the point where their minds are open to being challenged or having information delivered to them in certain ways. And if we change to things at that point, at that point where people are open to that, no, in some cases being forced to be open to that, then you've got some fighting chance of then just opening people's minds. And when we say opening people's minds, this is a technical thing. The neurons and the pathways in our brain are real. It's just like a computer. So when you and I both work with technical projects all the time, and we know there is a process of putting in hardware and a software program and all the configuration that goes on, where we need to make sure all the data is where we want it and it's all talking to each other in a specific way. Well, that design came from the best supercomputer ever invented, our own brains. So, and I think we just forget that the best supercomputer on this earth is in our own heads. And we've got to start treating it like it is that piece of hardware that is so important. So if we want this piece of hardware to work in an optimum way, and I'm not saying here, and definitely not advocating in this podcast, that is that you think my way. That is not what a change of mindset is about. I guess what I'm saying is that the world needs us all to have an agile mindset going forward. And that agile mindset is that we understand that we can be conditioned by a lot of this external media influences, people, everything that we have around us, our own experiences, our own assumptions that we make when we're doing our own little internal analysis on things. And we store all of that in this supercomputer that's in our heads. And if we just understood that a bit more, would we be open to understanding why our behavior manifests itself in the way it does sometimes? And even I've always been like this, actually. I can be very quick to judge because my brain works very fast, and sometimes I'll be way ahead of lots of other people and I'll have already made a judgment. But I'm also very quick to change my opinion on that. So I'll be the one that goes, oh, no, I get that. Oh, it's here, it's that, I'm doing that. And then I'll listen to another bit and go, oh, no, God, I was so wrong there. I was just so wrong. Sorry, I just could. So yeah, no, I get it now. I know. And this change of opinion and understanding that is fine, and that is what our brains are for, to take in all this stuff, not to say you shouldn't look at this, you shouldn't be exposed to this, you shouldn't listen to that person. Take it all in, but then when you've taken it in, do realize that how you store it, the way you store it, the emphasis that you put on it as you store that information will be relevant when you retrieve it.
Are you putting that on the individual then? Or how does, because again, the individual's acting within the environment, mostly the people around, I mean, him or her. Can you leave it up to the individual to change their own mindset, or do you need to change the environment around that individual? Or more to the point, can you change, is mindset change an individual thing, or do you have to change, like, is it a mindset change or is it a culture change? Is it possible to change minds without changing culture?
Oh my God, this is an amazing this is an amazing question. Amazing. Because I think this is where we're at now. I don't think it is. I think your ability to separate out is very difficult. So you would have to understand yourself and the way that what you do with what you're exposed to. You would have to be so conscious of it that you can be alongside and absorbed in a culture and separate the two things. But I think that is a very advanced position to be in. And I'm not saying people can't do it, of course they can. But I think if you're a bit more, you know what, I'll give this a thought when I've got a minute and I'm busy doing this and I'm having my life and I'm looking after the kids and what am I making for tea and God, how am I going to pay this energy bill that's coming in? If that is where you are most of the time, then it is very difficult. So I think the emphasis should be on getting back to a position where media messaging particularly becomes more objective, like it used to be. Now, so much of the media, so much of the news we hear has an opinion already attached to it. It's no longer that we're passed on a fact or a piece of evidence or a piece of genuine journalistic reporting where we're left to ourselves to decide how we feel about that. We are delivered that with an opinion, and that makes it very difficult. And that, I think, is affecting culture in lots of parts of the world differently, and also in subsets of the world very differently, because now, you know, what is culture? You know, we have the big culture piece, and then the different cultures of the things, the groups we choose to associate and be part of. So I think this is so interesting and so difficult.
So this is an idea I've just kind of been exploring much of this summer. In fact, I brought it up at the end of our previous podcast, but I'm going to give you kind of a homework problem, or like do right now homework problem, right? Let's imagine if the price of gasoline were $100 per gallon, and in my head, I'm guessing that's about 25 pounds per liter, but I'm trying to in
Have
my
you
head.
seen the dollar exchange rate at the moment?
I think I saw that it was 1 to 1.
Virtually, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So so but in any event, I mean, $100 a gallon in the US is about 25 times what it is right now. Imagine if the price of gasoline were 25 times. I mean, around the world, imagine if the price of gasoline were 25 times and it was going to stay that way. That it wasn't just a momentary blip. The reason it's going to stay that way is because we're actually going to pay for the external costs. So it's not the traditional capitalistic costs of mining petroleum and refining it and delivering it into the cars, but we're going to pay external costs, and the external cost is $100 a gallon. And because it's going to be $100 a gallon on January 1st, 2030. If you're the CEO of an automobile company or a aerospace company or an airline manufacturer, aerospace manufacturer or airline transportation company or a petroleum company, how you have it's September 1st, you have 7 years and 3 months, 7 years and 4 months to figure this out by 2030. How do you change not just your company, how do you change your culture to adapt to this new reality. That the demand for the price goes up so that the demand goes down.
Yeah. And I think this sort of example makes it easier, because it culturally now we are typically from generations of people who know how to solve a problem that is there. We now are not really from a generation that can see a future problem and know how to prepare for it. We are more accepting of something that's fact, that people are going to say. In fact, maybe genuinely, if the date is 2030, I can imagine people going absolutely mad, racing around with cars. It would be, it would be people flying everywhere, going, better get it done, because by 2030 all this comes to an end. And there would be a subsection of society who would be seeing the opportunity to come up with the alternative, and they would have an absolute fixed date to work to, and they would do it. That would motivate them to do it. And so I think where you have a situation where a date and an outcome can be known and seen, we have no issue. We would work towards it. The problem that we face is, despite the dates of 2030 or 2050 being bandied about in relation to needing to do something to avert a climate disaster, people have no ability to understand what that means, because a scenario where we avoid the disaster doesn't seem to be within our toolkit anymore, because we're just more accustomed now to dealing with the disaster. And that is a completely different mindset. So if we want people to look at averting a disaster and doing something different before the day happens, then we need to start changing the education system quite significantly.
Is it so actually, I mean, I think I'm going to bring you back towards that question then, and I'm going to ask is it is the so by the education system, I'm presuming that you mean people of the ages from 5 to 25.
No,
is that enough?
No, I guess I use now the term education in its most holistic sense, that people think they are educating themselves by being on Facebook and Twitter and reading what they read, and listening to the news and listening to the radio, and and listening to the extraordinary number of celebrity influencers that we have now, who dominate and influence so much of what people do. So my definition of the education system is that all those points that we are influenced would have to start influencing us to be proactive about averting a disaster. And they would, and I genuinely believe if those people did that, mindsets would change very quickly. But if they didn't, then we would have this fake news scenario all over again.
So let's imagine, if we want, let's imagine, I'm gonna refine my question a little bit, and actually give an example. So COVID-19, or a pandemic like COVID-19, was predicted in, actually, I saw some stuff in 2008.
Yeah.
There was the Bill Gates YouTube video in
Yeah.
2015. There's a terrific book by Ian Golden called The Butterfly Defect, which was 2014, and he talked about a pandemic. Actually, there was a movie in 2011. So there's all these things that said, this is how a pandemic might work. And let's imagine if you were the chief executive officer or the chief sustainability officer or something of, pick a company, an airline or an automaker or whoever, and somehow you were magically transported into the future to the year 2030, and you realized, oh my gosh, all this stuff that we're reading right now really is going to happen, and I'm the only one that knows it. I magically jump forward 5 years and magically jump back. I'm the only one who knows it. But I'm in control of this multi-billion-dollar, pick one, car company. How do you change your company?
If you're the only one that believes it, then you've got to work hard at getting your first follower. Do you remember when this was a big thing? It was I can't remember the guy's name. He did a TED talk about how it isn't the crazy one who did, and there was a video that went viral. It was sort of in everyone's talk for some time. And there was a guy at a festival, and he was in a field, and he crazy dancing on his own in the field. And people would look at him going, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" Until the next person came and crazily danced alongside him. And then when that first follower came, everyone else thought, "Oh, wow, that's a great thing to do. Now we're all going." And it was such a great moment to understand that the person who can see the future just needs to convince the next person. And then when that first follower is on board, it's amazing how many people will follow. So the important person is the first follower.
Yeah, right. Yeah, absolutely. So how do you build that first follower? And actually, I'm thinking of ExxonMobil. There was a vote for board positions a year or so ago, and there was a activist investor group who wanted to get on the board, and Exxon management did not want them there, but Exxon investors, most notably BlackRock, did want them there. And I think I think there were four people on the slate, and three of them, I think the investor was engine company one was the activist. So is that putting your is that how you start to do that? Is that how you
Yeah,
start putting your fast follow? I mean, you put them on the board.
yeah, because and it was something that I also had a client that worked in the oil and gas. It wasn't an oil and gas provider; it was a supplier to the oil and gas big players. And with them, and this is a few years ago now, but with them, I said, "What you need is a person from Extinction Rebellion here in the room. You want them here in the room." They were going, "Oh my God, no way. There's no way. Oh, why would you even suggest that?" And they thought I was the crazy one. But it's not. And this is how now we are talking about changing mindsets, but we're going beyond it a little bit in terms of that. How do you break a, a, a heritage structure that feels so embedded, so fundamental that it couldn't possibly change, but that of course you do, and that's why activists are so important in society. It's activism is I get so, in fact, I get so emotional actually when I think about how activists are demonized by our media today, and have been for years. And in the UK at the moment, we're seeing a lot of activism in terms of not only climate activism, but the resurgence of the unions, because workers' rights are being diminished all the time, and people who go to work just don't have enough money to live anymore. And that's at the same time where And we've never seen so many rich people and people at the top of organizations getting enormous bonuses. So going back to actually your very first question about societal change, there is a large degree, a significant amount of imbalance in the world at the moment. And so if we have those people that are in positions of influence who probably will, like me, get told they are the crazy one for making the suggestions that they're making. But if they do, like BlackRock did in that situation, have the support of somebody who says, you know what, we should have that, this is where it will change. And I personally have hope that those people exist. And at the moment, I absolutely love and have such respect for every single activist that is out there in the world right now, doing things and with real personal self-sacrifice, things that I would not do. And they put themselves out there not because they are just looking to disrupt the world, but because they are trying to wake everyone's minds up to say, if I am willing to do this, there is something worth you looking at here. That is the role of an activist. They are doing something just so that your brain might go, hang on, why would they do that? What is it you want me to look at here? And that starts that process that we were talking about, where your own brain is saying, is there something I need to know here? And when I look at it, does that make sense to me? And then we need the chain reaction of media outlets, though, to support and not demonize. And then of course we're into much more complicated questions, which may be for another podcast, about why in our business world and in society generally do we have situations where people would want to influence negatively. What do they have to gain by influencing that position negatively? And what, how do we change mindsets when we have those two opposing forces? How do we really understand? And I think we start getting into a lot of psychology at that point.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think I mentioned this in the podcast. I'm really interested in these balancing points. So, um, so on the one end, how does activism scale? Or I'll put it a different way. Let's say gasoline is $100 a gallon. Let's also say that there's just not enough battery materials to replace every existing internal combustion car with a battery powered car. How do you, that means car sales decline. That means the number of car jobs decline. I'm in the Detroit area, so quite frankly, I'm imagining huge unemployment out of the auto industry, and I don't see a lot of way around it actually. So how do you balance that dynamic between the activist who says the 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 planet is heating, we're having fires and floods and droughts and hurricanes, against the person who says, but this job is how I feed my family and how I pay for my kids to go to that education that they need to have.
And these are, this is where the politicians should be right now. These are the conversations that we should expect our politicians, the leaders that we have put in place of our nations collectively. This is what they should be spending their time on, because as soon as we have solved that question, if money is the answer to all the questions and the root of all evil, they used to say to me. It's still the same. Money is so fundamental to this puzzle. So, and money is a human construct. We made it. People used to just trade stuff. So there's always been a trading of some kind, but money is something that we invented. The financial system is something we invented, and it suited our purpose and has suited our purpose over lots of years. But let's face it, has changed. It's changed over time. It's not today what it was 100 years ago. It's not the same. It doesn't work in the same way. It doesn't mean the same things, other than in very basic terms for humans, going back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs again. So actually, humans are only obsessed with money because they want to make sure they have the security of the important things in life. So if we started saying that money was going to mean something different, or like the conversations that did start about a universal basic income, that let's not worry about money, everyone, because everybody is going to get enough money to live on. I know this sounds very communist idealist, and I don't want to go down that road. It's not that. And I want to stress that I really want people to take away, this is not a capitalist communist conversation. Again, that's a polarization that we have been conditioned to think. We are just saying that at some point, it is inevitable that we are going to have to see money differently. It's inevitable. So the thing that creates a lot of the chaos in our minds is fear. There are two primary drivers for mindset: love and fear. And so those two things dominate all our decisions when it comes to mindset. So our leaders should be tuned in enough to know this, and they should be settling our fear by saying, it's okay. We know there is inevitable change coming, but we've got this. We might not know today what it looks like, but it will look like something. And it won't mean that everyone is just destitute and you will not be able to survive in this world, because the whole world has to go through this inevitable change. And it disappoints me that the leaders of our world are not openly having these conversations, because it means that the result of this is ingrained fear in lots of people. And then, of course, a need to hang on to the things that we know will probably destroy us at some point, because they see no alternative to that.
So let me kind of finish this up with one big question. Can we prepare for the change that is actually, let me back up a step on that. So you're calling for political leadership. However, in a democracy, the people who are elected are conform with the ideas of the electorate. And what you see in the US, and I don't think Britain's immune from this with Brexit and such, but what you see in the US is a very polarized 50-50 split between the red team and the blue team. So is it possible for political leadership to move in a direction, to move mindsets in a direction that they're not currently on? Is it possible to lead people in a direction that conflicts with their existing mindsets into some completely new mindset?
I think it is possible if we keep things simple in terms of love and fear. So if we kept our change of mindset at that level, love and fear, and our elected leaders were more motivated towards a more positive messaging rather than a more fearful type of messaging. So at the moment, so much of what politicians do is led by fear. They instill fear in their messaging, and then the media collectively grabs onto that fear, and then we explode that. So we are bombarded with fearful messaging in many different layers, and that is completely out of balance with things identified with more positive side of love, where it be hope, or that everything will be okay and that the world will be better. We don't the balance is all out of kilter there. So if we had politicians who, and we are seeing some in the world, I'm going to get her name wrong now because I'm just overthinking it, but it's Jacinda. Is it Jacinda in New Zealand?
Jacinda. Oh yeah, in New Zealand, right?
Yeah. So in New Zealand,
Jacinda Ardern, right?
And there are some great politicians there. Now I just can't remember their names, but in the Scandinavian countries as well, where they are taking a completely different position, and they are very unapologetic of that different position. And that position is a more caring, love orientated position, where they are unapologetic about being humans in a position of leadership, having children, having stay-at-home husbands, going to a friend's house and having a party. All these things that are going on within leaders who are showing themselves to be very different, out of a completely different mindset than what we have been bombarded with over the last 10, 15 years. And so, the question I guess we don't know the answer to is, how many of those changes of leaders do we need to have to see a tipping point? We know that globally, everybody was very jealous of what was happening in New Zealand. Their approach to dealing with crisis was very different to what we'd have here in the UK, particularly. And yet we have leaders that even now are battling out among fear messaging, 100% fear messaging, and really quite an aggressive stance of a leadership battle. It's called a leadership battle. Now, everything that we do, everything that everyone is subjected to, is more aggressive, more negative, more, I don't care what he says, I'm going to do that and I'll make it work. No idea of how they're going to make it work. No pressure for them to come up with a plan even to show us. And that's just because we are so desensitized to politicians now behaving in this way, which of course has resulted in massive political disengagement by loads of people who are no longer interested, which skews the political system, because those people that want to hang on to this kind of world are the ones that still go out and vote. So there we are in this circle. So we do need a tipping point. I am hopeful that tipping point is coming, albeit very slowly. And it is so important then, going back to something else you'd said, that the onus is on ourselves to try and invest in a more balanced mindset. So not necessarily saying that you need to change your mindset, because of course, for everyone listening today, we have no idea what your mindset is. But investing in that necessity to have an agile mindset.
Is it possible, or maybe I'll put it that way, is it possible to reach that tipping point without casualties?
Probably not, based on where we are. If you quickly assess the situation and really, and the now hour and 10 minutes. Totally need to cut this scene. That I am my own nightmare in these situations. But yeah, when you quickly now just taking the conversation we've had today, and now just when you finish listening to this podcast, turn on the TV, listen to something, turn on the radio, have a chat with your friends, then it's difficult to see how this will happen without casualties. But you know,
I'm afraid the same thing, that I mean, in a democracy, the voters get the government they deserve, right? And I don't know at what point people will vote for love instead of voting for fear.
Yeah, I think the main thing is people have to start feeling love before they can vote for it. And there is that cycle we're in, and we have a lot at smaller levels. We have lots of local campaigns where people are so generous of heart, you know, support people in times of trouble, very supportive of local communities. You know, if we have an appeal on the TV, very quick to be part of that appeal. So that want and desire to be part of a community that cares, where love is the motivating factor, I think it is clear for everyone to see. And then it gets manipulated. And now I'm losing my voice. So this must be our signal to end. So, I mean, yeah. So anyway, you've got me talking on one of my favorite subjects. So thank you so much for doing that.
Of course. Well, that was the goal. I mean, I love listening to, I love talking to you. I love hearing your ideas. And that's what came out of the previous podcast was, oh man, I should interview you. So this has been fun for me. So.
So for everyone listening, and Jos, I hope we've answered your question in there somewhere. We would love to get more engagement on these sessions, and there's no reason why you couldn't be asking me the questions, or even Pat the questions, or anybody else. We are very open for this podcast to be used as a community platform. So please engage, let us know. And yeah, if you've got ideas for a next episode, we'd be very interested. So thanks so much, Pat, for today's session.
Oh, thank you, Nina.
As always.
Loads of fun.